I'm excited to be here, and I'm thrilled. Dr. Carr mentioned the many uses of the PIAAC data, and I think it's pretty awesome that we're starting with one that focuses on work in particular, coming from the U.S. Department of Labor. I do want to just add to the remarks that Sandra made. It's certainly a team effort in all we're doing for the support and implementation of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and we're working very closely with our partners at the U.S. Department of Education and Health and Human Services. And we know there is a ton going on across the field and across the country. So everyone is very busy and doing exciting things, and a day like today is great for us to take a step back and think about the future implications that some of this research that we'll learn about today and tomorrow will shed on all of our work. So we have another team here, as she mentioned, from Penn State University, and we have 3 research papers to dive into this morning and a discussant. I want to remind folks that the focus of these papers is threefold. One is to explore research findings, and then their implications for future research, as well as their implications for policy and practice. The format today will go through the 3 papers and then have some discussion. We'll do that before we do Q&A from the audience. You should have at your tables some forms that you can jot notes to yourself on questions that you have as the speakers are presenting, and then we'll spend the end of the session going through Q&A together. So please hold your questions, but jot them down as they come to mind. So let's start off. The first paper that we're going to hear about is the educational and cognitive transformation of social opportunity and inequality, credentials, cognition, and C status. Dr. David Baker, Dave, is going to present this for us. He is a professor of Education and Sociology in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Penn State University. He leads multidisciplinary research projects on the worldwide education revolution's impact on post-industrial society and global development. I'm looking forward to hearing about this paper, and I know the audience is too, so I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amanda. So what I'd like to do is talk about the relationship between credentials, educational credentials, skills, particularly cognitive skills, and outcomes, occupational outcomes. So there's an old song by Tina Turner, "What does love have to do with it?" And I see we could have used that today and said, what does skills have to do with it? But we're going to ask, what does skills and education have to do with it? And we're going to present a new idea called C status. So, there's academics worry about theory. We don't have to do that inside the Beltway too much. But there's been 2 big ways. There's been 2 big ways to think about the relationship among educational credentials, skills, and outcomes, occupational outcomes. And one's called credentialism, which is usually seen as a bad thing, and the other one is just straight technical functional arguments. So, I'm clicking. There we go. So if we take a credential argument all the way to its extreme, here's what it looks like. If we take it to the extreme, here's what it looks like. And a lot of people have this image, and there's a lot of theory out there that suggests this, that really skills don't matter, that the main thing is job credentials, and particularly the educational credentials, and there's really no effect of skill on outcomes. And there's a literature on this that I won't go into, but we can talk about it later. The converse, those little dashes down there, just my PowerPoint ineptness, just ignore those. The converse is that it's all skill, that educational credentials really don't matter much, and human capital arguments taken to the extreme would argue this, that workers end up with skills for various reasons, yes, maybe education, but a number of other reasons, and they take those into the labor market, and they're paid off for those, and employers make profit on those skills. So we have these two poles, but we all kind of know that that's not really how it works. And so the PISA data allow us to look at a more nuanced argument that indeed it is education and skills that work. And so this is what we want to explore today. So I don't need to go through this too much, but we looked at full-time workers from the US PISA. We're going to look internationally as our next step in this research. And they're 25 to 65 years old and so forth. So they're full-time workers. Boy, this is really moving now. So this is our first hypothesis, which is what you just saw, that both educational credentials and skill, particularly cognitive skill, matter to earnings and occupational prestige. This, we think, is how the world works. And we can test it quite nicely with PISA. And here,
PIAAC, dude. I can't let you say pizza again at the PIAAC conference.
that's why I'm last author.
Oh, no.
I've been in this business too long. Sorry. PIAAC. Sorry. Did I say that all the time? Oh, my God. Oh, God. I'm among friends. Yeah. All right. PIAAC. Yes, thank you. The PIAAC data is wonderful. And so here's our results for earnings. And it's quite interesting. So we did just a simple regression for each education level, and we plot those up there. And you can see the skill slope is quite steep for people with a BA and more. It's half as steep for people with some college or an AA degree. And it's almost nil, there's a slight slope, for people with high school and beyond in terms of earnings. At the same time, the credentials also buy you different levels of earnings. And so this is very interesting. And I think it's really the first time that we've had this kind of high quality data, particularly looking at cognitive skills. Now, we're not looking at all skills, but we're focused on cognitive skills. So then we also did this with occupational prestige in PIAAC. And this looks even stronger to what we had thought we would find. And again, we see the same kind of pattern. So it's both having an educational credential and having skills that buys somebody or is seen as somebody has quite valuable in the labor market, and this is what we end up finding. Because those regression lines are a little bit of an optical illusion, and it looks like there are people equally distributed all the way along those lines, what we did here was to show the actual distribution of people. And the thick bar there is one standard deviation on either side of the mean, and the thin bar is two standard deviations out. So you can start to see where the distribution of people are in terms of their educational levels and cognitive skill levels along those regression lines. And I think this is pretty compelling evidence that it is really both things that are driving the situation now. And there it is for prestige. And I'll come back to why prestige is important. Oftentimes prestige doesn't get the amount of appreciation among analysts that it should. So why? Why does this happen? Why is there this dynamic relationship between or among educational credentials and skills and job outcomes? And there's two big trends that have been happening, some for a long period of time, but both have been intensifying in recent times. The first one is, and this is one that we oftentimes don't see unless we look historically. The first one is that educational credentials have just pushed all other kinds of job credentials off the table. Okay, so this list here is, and it could have been double this size, is a list of old types of job qualifications and credentials and ways in which people found and got positions in other societies at other times, okay? And they were quite normal and they were quite everyday, people understood them and used them all the time. Most of these have gone away. Some are even illegal. And what has emerged is educational credentials over and over again. Educational credentials have been demanded now in all parts of the labor market. And they also are increasingly around degree completion, All right, so they've eclipsed, and we find this not in PIAAC, but we in other data sets, that it is degree of completion that even eclipsed just years of attendance. And there's been this entire intensification of a culture of education which has pushed educational requirements into most jobs. Some of the reasons why the whole licensing process brings education in. There's been a massive growth in licensing of many occupations, legal requirements. Professional associations oftentimes turn to educational requirements immediately to talk about new occupations. And a growing connection between the university producing knowledge for occupations and occupations themselves also embeds occupations in the educational structure. So all four of these then lead to a lot of educational credentials. I didn't even touch that, it just went. The red line is the growth in workers who have license. It goes up to about 30% there in 06. And the yellow line is the workers who are in unions. So this has been a big part of the credentialing story, among other things, in the American labor market. Same thing, but note that people with more education are more likely to be in occupations that are more likely controlled by licenses, which also then have many educational requirements in them. But it's not only at the top part of the market. Right now, to be a barber or a hair cutter, you have to have a high school diploma in about a third of the states. You have to be morally sound in only one state. That's Ohio. On the other side, skill. What's happening with skill? And this is fascinating as well. The usual idea is that jobs or economic enterprises are formed in somewhat of a vacuum, and then they look for labor. But what a lot of labor economists are finding now is that there's a lot of skill bias technology being used. In other words, technology that demands high skill, demands high cognitive skill. And increasingly, firms figure out ways to make money that way. And they don't always have to do it that way. What's interesting is that they respond to the labor force as much as the labor force responds to them. There's growing demand for cognitive skills, and it's not only just advanced technical skills, but general cognitive skills. So, how to think about this further? And we said, well, we think that really what's going on is that there's a joint effect of education and cognitive skills, that they work in tandem. Thank you. They work in tandem, and that we should think about them that way. And so we've developed this idea of C status, credential and cognition. C status, which we think is similar perhaps to something like a social economic status. And that this is what both workers take into the American economy, as well as this is the way in which jobs and economic enterprises organize themselves in terms of the kind of C status that they can find in the labor force. To test that idea, we developed a second hypothesis and said that these two things work jointly. And we can do that very nicely with the PIAAC data. And instead of doing sort of traditional interaction term, which is a little bit clunky, we did a confirmatory factor analysis, and these are some of the reasons for those of you who are technically into it. The credentials and cognitive skills in our samples are about 0.6, correlated 0.6, about 36% of the variance is shared. There are no means the exact same measure, which is interesting. And so we constructed then a C status construct, and indeed that works very well, and it is associated very strongly with earnings. We control for a lot of other things, in this case just two things, age and gender, but generally C status holds up no matter what we control for. And the same thing for prestige. You may notice that through all this, prestige is a little bit more highly related to C status than earnings. And that's interesting. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So why does C status make sense? Well, there's a growing set of literature on both sides of the issue that suggests that these are quite intensely intertwined. So there's some really nice literature now. I've contributed to some of it, and there's a growing amount of literature that suggests what actually happens in schools has very profound effects on people's thinking ability. Now that may sound like a funny thing to say, but a lot of times people think that that doesn't really happen much beyond just basic literacy, numeracy, and facts. But there's some nice evidence that suggests very profound domain general intelligence is shaped and enhanced through schooling. So this is a very important part of the equation. The second part of the equation is that we now are starting to see that it's not just attaining the degree that gets one to a certain position, but it's what they do while they attain that degree. And this is Michael Haut's work, and many, many other people are doing this kind of work, and they find the same thing over and over again. And actually, once into the higher education arena, pretty much one's family of origin has very little effect on what happens. It's what major, it's how well you do, it's what you learn. And that's also happening at the high school level as well. And lastly, so I've been talking a little bit about prestige, and oftentimes prestige is thought of as a weak measure of economic outcomes and authority outcomes, and people say don't use it. But there's some really nice research that suggests what it really shows is a very broad social consensus around it, how much a job has control over the nature of things and how much it uses reasoning or cognitive reasoning. So it fits that individual C status, as measured by PIAAC, and their and prestige are so highly related. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. The last 2 minutes, great. The last hypothesis that we wanted to look at, we wanted to say, well, let's take C status and map it onto the U.S. occupational structure. And we we thank our colleagues at Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we used some of their data. And so we basically plotted the size and types of occupations on C status, with the y axis there being the years of education and the X being the literacy, numeracy. We put those both together. I didn't say that. And this is very interesting. What this shows is that over half of the American full-time workers are in an occupation that demands both high levels of educational credentials and high levels of cognitive skills. There's a second large clump there, and then there's this very small third clump, which is farming, fishing, and forestry. And so right now the American economy is quite dominated by and demands people with both educational credentials and high cognitive skills. We also can show with the PIAAC data quite nicely what they're doing at work to a degree, and it fits this. So people at the higher levels are indeed reading, writing documents for work. People at lower parts of the C status are doing that far, far less. All right, so what does this mean for policy? The first thing is that both the skill and the education of the workforce are much more dynamically related to the economy. Oftentimes policy, and particularly politicians, act as if the economy is the dynamic thing and labor market is fixed, and our labor market never meets what we need in terms of the economy. Actually, they're quite dynamically related, and we should keep that in mind when we make policy. Secondly, the constant fear over overeducation, which is an outcome of the credentialing argument that I showed you early, is a pernicious myth. We should stop thinking about it. It does not happen. That does not mean there isn't pain in the labor market. There is, but the idea that there's a runaway education sector is wrong. It makes no sense. Actually, the economy and the education process is far more articulated. Finally, on this point, education is a major source of deeper cognitive skills. Therefore, equal access and school quality must be a top economic priority, not just an educational priority. Also, traditional vocationalism, which seems to always want to come back. I think there was comments about plumbers and so forth, most recently among some of our candidates for presidency. It's the wrong way to think about things. This is not how the world thinks about it. It's not how educators think about it. It's not how people who are getting education think about it. We need to stop thinking about the idea that we're training individuals for one particular job for the rest of their life with a set of specific skills. Not true. Even Germany doesn't do it, by the way. I can talk to you about that later. Yeah, I know, that's always the holy grail. So broad access to post-secondary education is essential for the future economic development of the U.S. Just straightforward, it is. This also, the C status, our work also ups the ante for lessening inequality. It's going to be much more difficult, much more complicated than we've thought. It is not only getting to school and getting people into school with reasonable quality, but it's making sure that they learn some important things there. Finally, and I'm almost out of time, although this is not. It's not just an issue of training. We also have to keep in mind policy-wise that there's a tighter and tighter connection between the R&D sector, and particularly what universities do in that R&D sector, and what happens in the training of individuals and the economy. Sometimes this is overly simplified and we think, oh, some scientific discovery is going to just equal a job. No, it doesn't work that way. But the American universities and other R&D institutions are the most vibrant in the world. They've produced the most knowledge in the world, and they continue to do that. Yes, the Chinese are catching up, but we're still way out ahead. And we have to use that in a thoughtful way, both in terms of developing massive access to education in those institutions and there are other similar post-secondary institutions, and making sure that people learn those critical skills, particularly thinking skills. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to follow that up with Frank Fernandez and Mark Umbricht. Education and work in the 21st century, credential inflation or transformation. They are both PhD candidates in the higher education program at the Center for Study of Higher Education at Penn State. Frank has interests in education and pathways to the professoriate, community college, non-traditional students, and the politics of higher education. And Mark's interests are institutional research, finance, student outcomes, and first-generation students in higher education. So I will turn it over to Frank first. Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and start us off, and then later on I'm going to switch to Mark. Mark will come up here and talk for a little bit. But I'm going to talk about the motivation behind our study, and then some of the really why it's important, the significance of our study. For theory a little bit, but really more for policy. So I get to be bossy. I get to say when to advance the slide. So let's go ahead. Oh, there we go. So the motivation for the study. So I'm going to read you a lot of quotes just to get us started off. But a few of them coming out of the New York Times. It takes a BA to find a job as a file clerk. And the college degree is the new high school diploma. I remember hearing that as I was starting to grow up and go through college. And then right when I got my college degree or my new high school diploma, then it was, well, you got to go get a master's. I'm like, dang it. And then I got into a master's program and got to meet my first sociologist. And he introduced me to the idea of credential inflation and like, well, it really doesn't matter which credential you get because they're all being worth less than they were when I was growing up anyway. It's like, oh, well, that sucks. And then I got to Penn State and decided to think, is this true? We've got two ways of thinking about it. And then this latest idea of digital Taylorism. And so building on the original idea of Taylorism and kind of Fordism, and you can just interchange people with technology and really kind of dumb down work and pay a lot less. And so all these things have kind of been thought pieces for Mark and I as we were trying to do this work. And so we'll go to the next slide. So it makes it even more fun to watch the presidential debates when you get to hear quotes like this on both sides of the aisle. And so the first one, a college degree today is the equivalent of what a high school degree was 50 years ago. And then the second, I can't do a Texas accent, will reignite the promise of America. Young people coming out of school will find, instead of no jobs, 2, 3, 4, 5 job opportunities. And so both sides really kind of implicitly feeding this idea of credential inflation, that even if you go to college, it's not going to help you the way that it once did. And the significance of the study for policy is really, if this idea continues to be pervasive, if people buy into it, it suggests that really increasing college access isn't going to help. And in fact, it might hurt people who already have degrees. The people who advance the digital Taylorism idea really even go so far to suggest that the government is wasting its money almost. You know, they're putting forward all these programs and financial aid and subsidizing student loans, and it's all for nothing because you're helping people get degrees that really don't matter. So that's where the theory kind of brought us to. What is the next slide? And this is where they really give that quote. I won't read it to you, but the last part, this book explains why much of the money, the effort, the enterprise will be wasted on as the neoliberal opportunity bargain fails to deliver on the promise of education, jobs, and rewards. And so right at the time, you know, they published this book in 2011, and then PIAAC went and saved the day. They went and collected the data that we needed to actually test, is this true? So we'll go to the next slide. So I've hinted to these ideas already, but we've got these competing ideas. Credential inflation predicts that as education levels increased, which they have over the past 20 years, that education would be a weaker predictor of good employment, of getting employment, and of the types of earnings that employed people then get. The digital Taylorism argument suggests that as globalization took place, as technology really went into all types of jobs, that employers use technology to reduce costs and increase control of the types of work that people do. Reduce the cost of knowledge work was another quote from that book. And it would predict that employers might pay less to workers who are using technology very often in the workplace by dumbing down the work, by taking out kind of workers' autonomy and their ability to use their skills, that you can pay them a lot less. On the other side, though, building a little bit on Dave's work, we have this idea that maybe it's dynamic, maybe schooling and the workforce are kind of have this interesting interplay. And as education levels increase, maybe we don't see kind of a weakening of economic opportunity, but instead the labor market is changing. And so maybe the job tasks that people are asked to do respond to that. And so people are given more complex job tasks or do them more frequently because they have these greater skills and better education. So then really the converse side to what I started with, credentials, maybe they don't inflate. Maybe education actually becomes stronger over time. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark, and Mark will talk you through the research questions and all the data stuff. He's a little bit better at that. And we'll end with our policy implications. But again, thank you so much.
Hello, good morning. So the main research question we wanted to ask is, what's the relationship between years of education, skills, and different types of employment status, type of employment and earnings? And so we had a wide array of dependent variables that we used here. So in terms of employment status, we wanted to know, whether or not a person had a job, whether or not they had a full-time job, 35 hours or more, and whether or not they were a supervisor on the job. In terms of type of employment, we looked at what types of skills are they actually doing at work. And we'll explain a little more about what those were later. And finally, we wanted to look at how our years of education, skills, and earnings related. We also wanted to note that we ran separate analyses using education as levels. So less than high school degree, all the way up through BA and above. But we found that the results were very similar, so we decided to go with an interpretation that was a little bit easier, which was, sorry, saw stuff moving up here. I got a little confused here. So we used separate analyses, and we found everything was similar, but we like the interpretation of an additional year of education is equal to this this type of effect. So we decided to go with that. Go to the next slide. So for the study, we actually used 3 different data sets. We used PIAAC, and then we used 2 of the earlier versions of the data set, which is the Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey from 2003 and the International Adult Literacy Survey from 1994. Unfortunately, we were unable to get a hold of a restricted version of the 1994 ILS, so we had to restrict some of the variables we were using, and also we didn't have a good measure of income from that earliest study, so we could only compare 2003 to 2012. We used multiple imputation to account for any missing data we had, and we used the appropriate weights in all models, and for models that we used literacy, we used the plausible values. Next slide. So our first research question, we wanted to examine the relationship between years of education, skills, and employment status. And we used logistic regression for this, since all of our dependent variables were either yes or no questions. For all these models, we controlled for age, gender, immigrant status, and parental education. And this is our findings for our first set of regressions we were just looking at years of education for this set of models. So what we found is that these are the odds ratios and then the standard errors in parentheses there. So we found is that for each additional year of education, there was about a 20% increase in the likelihood of being employed in 1994 in the ILS survey. This dropped down in 2003 for ALL, but increased back to 17% in PIAAC. Full-time employment, we found that there was only significance in the PIAAC survey, but otherwise it was lower in terms of the odds ratios there. And finally, for supervisor status, there was about each additional year of education was about a 20% increase in the likelihood of being a supervisor for those who are working. This dropped down only 5% in ALL, but then rose back up to about 11% in PIAAC. So we're kind of seeing shifts across these different surveys in these different time periods. Next slide. So this next set is we included literacy in these models. And so the top part of this table is basically a mirror image of what we saw before, but now we're accounting for literacy. So as you can see, the coefficient or the odds ratios are a little bit lower in this table, which means that the literacy was drawing out some of the relationship between years of education and these dependent variables. So now instead of a 20% increase in 1994, there's only a 15% increase in the likelihood of being employed. When we look down at literacy, though, we only saw significance for whether you were employed or not. We didn't see any significance for full-time employment or supervisory status. However, in the employment models, we saw there was very high odds ratios. So for each additional year of education in 2003, for example, you were 46% more likely to be employed, which is quite high. Next slide. For the next couple of slides, we wanted to make sure that people who are viewing this afterwards or maybe weren't able to attend the conference could follow along. So I'm not going to read through all of our findings here because we just kind of walked through them before. But the one thing to point out is at the bottom, since we were dealing with several different surveys and we wanted to see if there were actual statistical differences across these different time periods, we ran additional statistical tests and found there was actually no relationship in terms of over time did years of education become more or less important. So we ran that statistical test and there was no significance. In terms of employment status, I think we covered both of these, but so we found that literacy was not statistically significant to full-time employment, and that it was only, or years of education was only significant in PIAAC and not significant in the other 2 models. And finally, on supervisor status, so I'll take you to the second bullet point. Years of education actually had a stronger relationship to supervisor status in the first survey in 1994. And actually went down for the 2003 and for the 2012 versions of the survey. And that was statistically significant. So that was a shift that we saw. Our second research question, we decided to examine the relationship between years of education, skills, and some job tasks. So you can read the job tasks. I'm not going to read through all of those because there's quite a few of them. But what we did is we did a multinomial logistic regression. So instead of a yes/no question here, we have 3 different levels. We had rarely or never, less than once per week, or more than once per week. For those of you who are familiar with PIAAC, there are more groups, but when we combined them across all 3 surveys, the way that the answers were phrased, we had to combine it into only 3 groups. So our reference group for all of these models was rarely or never. So we have the rarely or never group, and then we compared it to the less than once a week, and then also to the more than once a week. And once again, we controlled for age, gender, immigrant status, and parental education. Before we did our models, we also wanted to look at kind of over time, what have the changes looked like in terms of just descriptive statistics. So the next couple slides are going to be just some basic graphs showing the changes over time. So this is the percentage of workers performing tasks less than once per week. So this is the middle group there. And so what we saw with this was there were a lot of people that were moving up in these categories over time. Right? So the groups of people were moving up in these categories over time. So the less than high school, see they were using or reading or using directions or instructions more over time. One thing that we noticed is the letters and memos and emails. That job task was actually highly dominated by people using it more than once a week. So you see that there's a very small percentage that were actually in the less than once per week category. So almost everybody uses email in the job nowadays. The second set of graphs, I think, even shows it more, that we can see these differences both across education levels and also across time, that we're seeing these increases. So particularly for manuals, reference books, and catalogs, we see there's large jumps across the 3 surveys. And also there's very differentiated levels between the different education levels. And I realized after we sent this in that we have the same graph on the last slide and this one on the right there, so if we'll ignore that one. We have all these graphs in our full paper, so if you want to look at the 6th one there. Once again, the reading or using diagrams or schematics is also, we're seeing these increases over time for each education level. When we actually ran our multinomial logistic regression models, we were seeing some positive relationships between years of education and literacy for people who are performing job tasks more than once a week, so the highest group, compared to the rarely or never, the lowest group. And if you look at the numbers that we have here, on the left-hand side is the odds ratios for literacy, and the right-hand side is the odds ratios for years of education. And so for literacy, what we did, I guess I forgot to mention this before, is for literacy, we did a 50-point increase. So that's approximately equal to increasing by 1 level, if we're talking about levels of literacy. So for each 50-point increase in literacy, we saw in IALS that people were 90% more likely to use or read emails, memos, or emails. And in part of this is because this is so high is because there are so few people in that low category that it kind of skews things. We also saw significance for the reports, articles, and magazines, so using or reading those on the job. And we saw that in terms of literacy, it actually decreased over time from 80% to 30% increase. But we actually saw that years of education was becoming slightly more significant when you compare 1994 to the 2012 PIAAC data. Thank you. Finally, our last question, we examined the relationship between years of education, skill, and earnings. So we used linear regression, of course, and we used actually the natural log of income there. We had all of our same controls, and we also added a third model that included, we actually included industry, I think, instead of occupations. That is incorrect. But use industry and information communication technology skills, which is actually a composite of ICT skills at work. So this is not the literacy, numeracy, or problem solving, but your the skills at work. And so what we saw is this is kind of 3 sets of models here. So for the first model, for each additional year of education in 2003, there was about a 7% increase in earnings compared to a 12% increase in PIAAC. So it's becoming more significant. Once we added in literacy, the years of education went down slightly. However, we saw that literacy was even across both surveys. So a 50-point increase in literacy was about a 13% increase in earnings. But once we added in that ICT at work variable and industry, we found that years of education had the relationship was a lot smaller. So there's only a 5% increase, and the effect, so not causal, but the relationship between literacy and earnings was actually had gone away after accounting for that. And that would be because if we're comparing people who are in, we'll just say in the field of engineering, years of education and skills going to have a lot less of an effect or a relationship than comparing engineering to construction. There's going to be a lot more of a difference there. I'm just going to skip over that one. I have a lot of time. I'll skip over that one too. Sorry, I'm almost out of time here. Well, all of these are, all of our other findings are in our full paper, which can be found online later. So to summarize what we found little evidence of the credential inflation. So as education rose, even albeit a small amount over time, economic returns to education did not decline. So we saw that income actually, or the relationship between income and literacy and income and education actually went up. We also found little evidence of digital Taylorism, which would normally suggest that the ICT skills at work would be negatively related to earnings. And we actually found the opposite effect. It was positively related. However, we did find some evidence of transformation. So as Americans became more educated, people with similar levels of education were more likely to perform some complex job tasks in 2012 compared to the previous surveys. So it appears that there is this dynamic relationship between education, literacy, and job tasks. We had a couple limitations. We would have preferred if this was like a very longitudinal data set, but that obviously is not what it is. But we did use z-tests to distinguish between the results across the surveys. And I guess the ideas of credential inflation and digital Taylorism are a little more complex than we're presenting here. But in particular, there are some researchers that suggest that these are more of an international process. So we only looked at the domestic labor. I think there's some papers later looking more at the international aspect of this. However, we did control for occupational categories to help control for some of these things. So for policy implications, we suggest that education is not somehow less valuable in contemporary society. So we had all these quotes earlier before saying that education has become less valuable over time, and we refute that. We found that years of education was positively related to employment, supervisor status, and earnings. And policymakers should continue to increase access to higher education across the life course, including access to community college and post-baccalaureate programs. And educational policymakers and practitioners should also consider the relationship between education, literacy, and job tasks, and how this may be dynamic. And I think also researchers need to consider this as well. In higher education, we often have just education as a predictor. We need to also consider if we can bring it in, literacy and those cognitive skills. So workers may be increasingly asked to perform multiple types of tasks, and education training should prepare students to enter complex workplaces. And I think this is our last slide here. Practitioners should try to develop curricula to improve cognitive literacy skills. So both years of education and skills tended to have statistically positive effects. So with the combination of that, as we heard from the last presentation, that combination of those two might be more important. And similarly, we encourage the development use of the ICT skills at work, which were positively related to earnings. And we hope you enjoyed our presentation, and thank you very much.
And Mark.
Next up, Carly Ford, who is an assistant professor in the Education Policy Studies at Penn State, will present. Her research focuses on the relationship between education and social stratification, and she'll be presenting on social background and numeracy skill levels among college graduates, social mobility, or social reproduction. Thanks.
So today I'm presenting on a project that I'm working on with Mark. We are looking at first-generation college graduates and multi-generation college graduates and their labor market outcomes and numeracy skill levels. So I'm going to say click. Oh, the clicker works. Okay. So to get us started, I wanted to define these two groups. So when we talk about first-generation college graduates, for this work, we're talking about someone who graduated with a bachelor's degree and neither one of their parents reported attending, or they're reporting that neither one of their parents attended college. And when we're talking about multi-generation college graduates, we're talking about someone who graduated with a BA and one or both of their parents graduated from college. So you can think that they have multiple generations of college going in their family. We don't know that the first generation college student is really first in the family because we just have two generations. We just have parent and individual. It would be great for future research if PIAAC could get more generations because we do know that grandparents matter with college going. So one of the reasons why I got curious about first generation and multi-generation college graduates is because where I sit in an education policy studies department and at the Center for the Study of Higher Education, we care a lot about first generation college students. We talk about kids coming out of high school and which kinds of colleges they're applying to. We think about first generation college students and their pre-college skills. When they arrive on campus, we talk a lot about how engaged they are, their rates of attrition and their rates of persistence, and then finally, rates of first generation college graduation. But something interesting happens after college graduation. Suddenly, we're not talking about first generation and multi-generation college graduates. They become this nebulous group of college graduates. We stop talking about social origins. And with the paper that Dave presented, and I'm sure with other papers today, you'll see that when we start talking about labor market, we lose this thread of research and we talk about different levels of education. So I became curious about really what are these post-graduation outcomes between first generation and multi-generation college graduates. So there actually is a good historical reason why we think that after college, everyone is a college graduate and social origins don't matter. And it comes out of the status attainment tradition. I'm still young in my career, so I have to talk to you about theory for a minute. So it comes out of the status attainment paradigm from the University of Wisconsin. This group of scholars published papers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Many of you probably studied this in graduate school. I certainly did. And they used nationally representative data sets to look at the relationships between social origins, education, and social destination. So really mapping this question of mobility. So social origins are parental education and parental occupation. So really this question of are you a first generation or a multi-generation college student? And as we know, social origins has everything to do with whether people go to college and whether they finish college. But what we find from this group of papers is also that education is the predictor of social destinations. So what kinds of occupations people end up in, their earnings, all of their occupational outcomes. As you notice, there's no line there between social origins and social destinations. All of the advantages and disadvantages of your social origins are mediated through education in this group of papers. And so another thing we became, so here's the summary quote by Hout. So origin status affects destination status among workers who do not have bachelor's degrees, but college graduation cancels the effect of social background status. So it's this idea that you're a multi-generation college student or a first-generation college student until graduation, and then your background status no longer matters in your post-college outcomes. So all of this work used education as either a linear measure of years or a categorical measure of credential, and assumed that it was a proxy for skills. So we became curious about whether this relationship still holds if we control for skills. So that's where this question about skills and generational college graduate status arises. So our two research questions are descriptive and I think foundational. So the first, we're looking at, are there skill differences between first-generation college graduates and multi-generation college graduates? And we're focusing on numeracy here. We ran everything for literacy, and the findings were very similar. We think numeracy is a little cleaner of a measure because there are people in the sample who are non-native English speakers, and we think numeracy is just a little cleaner at what their actual skills are. And our second research question is looking to see if there's generational status differences in labor market outcomes. And PIAAC has a wide variety of economic outcome indicators, and we're going to focus on 4, which I'll tell you about in a moment. We think this work is important for 2 reasons. It adds nuance to this status attainment paradigm, this relationship between social origins, education, and social destinations by questioning whether education actually is a good proxy for skills or how skills perhaps plays into the relationship. And then also we think that the equity agenda that motivates people to care about first-generation college students in high school and in college shouldn't be lost at graduation, that equity agenda should carry through into the labor market and after. And so we should continue to care about what happens to first-generation students. So for the first research question, we have numeracy as the dependent variable, and we have an OLS regression. We control for a vector of covariates, mostly ascriptive background characteristics. We're imputing where there's missing data. There wasn't too much. And again, we're using appropriate weights. And for numeracy, we use all 10 of the plausible values. For the second research question, we have 4 economic labor market outcome indicators that we looked at. The first is monthly earnings, which is a self-reported take-home pay in 2012 dollars. We used employment status, which is just a measure of whether or not someone was employed at the time of the survey. We looked at occupational prestige, which I think Dave alluded to is somewhat of a controversial indicator, but I like it because I think it's less volatile than earnings or employment status. So your monthly earnings can go up and down. You can be employed or unemployed pretty easily, but your occupational status, your occupational prestige is pretty stable and pretty sticky, and is a good measure of your overall economic well-being. If you're a doctor, whether or not you're earning now or later, whether you're unemployed in this moment, your occupational prestige is more stable. And then finally, our last economic indicator that we looked at was a variable that we created between the major that someone reported studying in college and the industry and field of their occupation that they reported being in at the time of the survey. So we were curious to see if perhaps first-generation college students were majoring in things and then not finding work in that field, and if multi-generation college students perhaps had more luck at that. So this is a new kind of economic indicator that we were interested in. We'd be very open and interested in your feedback about what you think of that as an economic outcome. And for all of these models, we're controlling for numeracy, and then the same covariates, and again, we're weighting and using plausible values. So our sample is US-based. We're looking at college graduates. We wanted to catch them after they had graduated from college, but before they had left the labor market, so they're all 25 to 54. and we had about 1,000. So rather than showing you big regression tables with small numbers, I'm just going to show you the coefficients for the covariates that were most important. So we've got multi-generation there on your left, and first-generation college graduates on your right. And so the first research question we wanted to know, were there numeracy differences between these two groups after graduation? And indeed we do find that social origin continues to matter after graduation for multi-generation and first-generation college graduates. They have significantly different and large magnitude differences in their numeracy scores. So for the next models, we're controlling for numeracy, and we find that, and these are the economic outcome indicators. We find non-significant differences, spoiler alert, actually for all of these. So between multi-generation and first-generation college graduates, all are, on average, are earning between $4,000 and $5,000 monthly. So all are doing quite well, we think, in monthly earnings, and we don't see significant differences between those two groups. In terms of occupational prestige, they were almost identical, both close to 40 on the ISCO scale. 89 would be being a medical doctor, 15 would be being a busboy, so very comfortably on the high end of that scale. And again, non-significant differences between the two. Similar findings for employment. Multi-generation and first-generation college graduates have almost look identical in their likelihood of being employed. Only about 10% in each group, when we controlled for everything, were unemployed. And then this measure of major and match, were there differences between multi-generation and first-generation college graduates? We find no. For both groups, about 60%, both groups, people had about a 60% likelihood of being in an occupation that matched the major that they reported in college, which I thought was surprisingly high. I think we hear about a lot of people graduating from college and ending up in retail or ending up doing something totally different. So we thought that was high. So this set of findings I've been describing as a cup half full and a cup half empty. So the part that's half full is that when we control for numeracy, when we control for skills, first generation and multi-generation college graduates look very similar. They're earning at similar rates. They have similar levels of occupational prestige. They have similar rates of employment, and they're matching into occupations that match their major at similar rates when we control for skill. However, they have large skill differences. So multi-generation college graduates are outscoring first-generation college graduates at large and significant margins. So how this fits back into our status attainment paradigm is that we do see the impact of social origins in education, and we're adding skills there, right? That's Ford and Umbrick 15. So we see differences between first generation and multi-generation college graduates in that first arrow. However, when we control for education and skills, the same relationship holds. College graduates have similar outcomes no matter if they're first generation or multi-generation when we control for skills. So the policy implication here, I think the big takeaway is that colleges don't entirely close the skill gap that exists before college. We know there's lots of good work, qualitative, quantitative, ethnographic, that first generation college students come to college with skills that are not as strong as multi-generation college students. And though that seems to persist through and out of college. So we suggest to policymakers that you identify and reward colleges that focus on the skill gap between first generation and multi-generation college graduates and are having some success closing it. And then our other policy recommendation is more of a hope that people in the room who have power will put pressure on PIAAC or other nationally representative data sets to collect the names of institutions that people attend. So I think these findings are very interesting, but we'd be able to say deeper and richer things if we knew whether someone went to a small liberal arts college, whether they went to a huge state university. We'd be able to do fixed effects. We could put students nested in institutions. In this age of big data, there's no reason not to. So I want to leave you with that as a recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carly. It sounds like another Go team effort is would happen as a result of adding that data element. So we're going to close here with some discussion from Maureen Conway, who is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. Maureen founded their Workforce Strategies Initiative and has headed up workforce research at the Aspen Institute since 1999. So I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will maybe just sit here and talk about some of my comments on the papers. Thank you for inviting me to read and reflect on these papers and think about their implications. I should say a little bit about the Economic Opportunities Program and the Workforce Strategies Initiative. The kind of research we've been doing for many years is really looking at a variety of programs on the ground that work every day trying to connect low and moderate income Americans to better jobs and try to help them gain skills to advance in the labor market. And we've done a lot of evaluation research and other research. I should also say, at one point in my career, it's interesting to hear theory, right? One point in my career, I started a PhD program in economics. I was in this micro class. A friend of mine presents this empirical research. The professor says, well, I'm a theorist, not an empiricist, and doesn't respond. I left that program shortly thereafter. So that just gives you a little insight into the kind of perspective that I bring. I am looking at what are people experiencing on the ground and what are the struggles that they're dealing with and what are the actual strategies people are using to try to address those. That said, as it turns out, I'm married to an economist and literally some of my best friends are economists. So there's the irony. So I think first of all, I just want to echo some of what has been said earlier today. I think that the papers reflect some of the value of the PIAAC data. I think it's a very rich data source. The juxtaposition of the education attainment with the actual skills and cognitive abilities that were measured, I think is really interesting. I think that the credential cognition C-status concept was really interesting concept. The idea that you can sort of look differently at what's the effect of a credential versus what's the effect of actual skills and abilities, and what's the synergies between the two. I think that's a real contribution, and so I think that these papers all do demonstrate some of the value of this data. Okay, so now I turn into a little bit of the skunk at the party. So I think. Some of the choices, I think, however, in the analysis surprised me a little bit. So first in the sort of first-gen, multi-gen paper, they said, given that our study focuses on employment outcomes, we chose to remove all respondents that were not employed. So not being employed is an employment outcome, so I wouldn't want to remove them. And then similarly, in the credential cognition and C-status, they limit the sample to full-time working adults. And given that nearly 20% of the labor force is actually employed part-time, that's a significant limitation. And in particular, I think you could see that in the chart where he had the sort of bubbles of size of employment. And the service sector size was quite low and very low relative to what the actual service sector employment is. So I think this gives you a significant bias in the results against sort of overvaluing education and what's going to happen because you're taking out so many of the employment opportunities in which education is not a key feature. And then, sort of one of my final comment on findings, I have to say that, in the Fernandez and Umbrick paper, they presented, some findings that I think are quite reasonable in terms of certainly people with more education are more likely to earn more, they're more likely to be supervisors, they're more likely to be employed. I think a number of the papers, and I won't remember which ones, I did want to call this out, commented that the race variable was difficult to use. I think that it's important to keep in mind, I was thinking about this in sort of the multi-gen piece, the idea that college erases background, that college attainment erases background. And yet, if you look at unemployment for blacks versus unemployment for whites, right? Unemployment for blacks is double at every education level. So I think education erases some things, but obviously not all things. And I think we really do need to be mindful of that and not overlook some of these things that are going on in the labor market. So I think I was very surprised in the Fernandez and Umbricht paper that they noted at the outset that our models do not support causal inferences. They nonetheless conclude our models support the conclusions previously reached by others that education has strong effects on labor market outcomes. And so this seems this seems contrary to the analysis, which actually indeed does not support causal inferences. They go on further to state rather than fretting that college graduates may have more difficult finding good jobs, policymakers and journalists should focus on the positive effects of additional schooling and work to increase higher education. I think that I wouldn't advise them to be political advisors. I think that statement is fairly dismissive to the many, many challenges that people are facing and that many people are struggling with as they see people both struggle with debt, not earn enough. Certainly, people with college do earn more, right? But do they earn enough? Do they earn enough to pay back their college loans? I think that this is takes a really more nuanced look at the data and should not sort of be sweepingly dismissed. I think that would be a mistake. So we were asked to talk about sort of comment on the findings, implications for research, and implications for policy practice. So with respect to future research, I do think more attention needs to be paid to what's going on to the whole labor market and not just the part where they got full-time jobs. I think we need to understand sort of how are people who are unemployed, what is their education and skills? To what degree are we wasting human talent among people who are unemployed and underemployed? I think more attention needs to be paid to the changing conditions of the labor market in general, and whether or not the education system has the capacity to influence those conditions. I have spent, as I mentioned, quite a number of years encouraging a range of organizations, community colleges, public agencies, nonprofits of various kinds, to train job seekers that have skills that employers in their local labor markets are looking for. This is something we've worked very hard on helping organizations do. And the limiting factor for many of these organizations is that there are not enough of these good jobs in their labor market to actually connect people to. In looking at the revised BLS projections yesterday, I don't know how many of you looked at the recent projections that they released. They're not terribly dissimilar to what's been seen before. Of the top 15 occupations expected to add the most jobs between 2014 and 2024, 8 required no formal education credential at all, nothing. A 9th required only a high school degree. Between them, these 9 occupations account for 25% of the jobs BLS expects to be added between 2014 and 2024. I know projections are iffy, right? They can be wrong. Projections are sort of your best guess, but there's no real reason to doubt these numbers given the current trends. If you read the monthly jobs reports, retail, food service, and drinking establishments, and healthcare have all been regular contributors to leading job growth. So it is not a surprise to see home health aides, nursing assistants, retail salespersons, cook, food prep, and food serving workers among the occupations expected to add the most jobs. Sure, many of the fast-growing occupations require advanced degrees, but their numbers are smaller, so it's easier for them to look like they're the fast-growing occupations. Indeed, the only occupation that shows up on both the largest list and the fastest-growing list is home health aides, one of the very lowest paid occupations. So this brings me to some of the implications for policy and practice. I mentioned that I think one of the values these papers show is the value of capturing cognitive ability in addition to education, and I think that that's important, and I think that we should think about other ways that that can be done as a practice within education and as a practice within employment training. A second thing I think about is that educators should carefully consider whether they want to be responsible for the labor market outcomes of their students. Now, I mentioned I've worked in the job training field for a long time, and job training has long been lambasted for not working because they're not getting people into good jobs, right? So there's only a limited amount that you control within the education system. There are many other factors that influence labor market outcomes besides what is somebody's preparation for a job, right? There's the common phrase, people quit their bosses, they don't quit their training program. So I think that it's important to keep these things in mind about what affects labor market outcomes. Let's see. So I can get a little passionate about this. So I see I've got myself way off on what I was actually going to say. I did want to mention that a number of researchers have been looking at questions of job structure and considering how redesigned jobs can use skills and could and ways jobs can be redesigned to ultimately be more productive, right? So how can, I mentioned home health aides earlier, how can home health aid jobs be designed to actually use skills, be better jobs, and be rewarding for workers? There's lots of work that's going on at a practice level looking at how this is possible, and I think that we need to do more to lift this up. There's similar work that's been done in retail. I think we really need to think about skills utilization and how do we encourage skills utilization in ways that make these large and growing jobs better. So that brings me to my last point, which is, yes, of course we should invest more in education. This was called What We Need Skills For. We are in a complex world. We should encourage learning. We need skills for many things. Managing work, getting better jobs, managing money and savings, navigating healthcare systems, participating in civic life. Skills are critically important. These are complex tasks a better educated citizenry will accomplish to the benefit of all society. Education is a tremendous public good and can create productive capacity that can power the economy if the conditions are right. But other conditions are important, and education can't do it alone, and I don't think we should try to prove that it can. So that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to allow the presenters to make some remarks in response to Maureen's comments and issues that she raised.
Thanks, Maureen. I don't think you're a skunk at the party. I think you're a very passionate voice. All of the things that you raised are things that we think about every day. As you know, these are fantastic data, but one's also limited to what they have. And I think that looking at other parts of the labor market will be important, and we can do that with these data. I don't think we're trying to say in any of these three papers that education drives absolutely everything. And of course, this is cross-sectional data. And we have mixed in there all the effects of people who have jobs which the job themselves creates more cognitive skill or less cognitive skill. So we have all those effects in there. And there's a Matthew effect in the sense that those with cognitive skills get more cognitive skills for lots of reasons. And so I think we're trying to suggest a more nuanced view that policymakers can take. There's always this split between what should be and what is. And I think what the PIAAC data can do is it can give us a deeper look of what is. Now, we may not like what is, and we probably shouldn't like always what is, and you raised some very good points to that effect. But I think we have to start and look at this. I mean, one of my slides, I said that our work, all of our work, really ups the ante for thinking about inequality, and I think that's what you're saying. Yes, you know, service jobs and so forth are growing, but by the way, those are also increasingly credentialed by education. So who's most vulnerable in our labor market right now? It's the person without a high school diploma without many skills. They're extremely vulnerable, and that one on our earnings shows that quite dramatically. So I don't think we disagree, at least from what I see very much. Also, we're not trying to say that there's no pain in the labor market. There is, and getting educational degrees is difficult. It's expensive. It takes people out of the labor market for a long time. But as a society and an economy that seems to thrive on that, we're going to have to make social policy around those kinds of issues. It is the way that things are working. So all the downside of a highly educated society is what policy has to address. So I agree with you in that sense. Thank you a lot for your comments. Maybe.
No, I would just echo and say thank you very much. I think you've highlighted some directions for future research for us. So you're absolutely right. There is certainly an interaction and a relationship between generational status and race, and that's something we want to look at. And considering the part-time worker piece of the labor market is also a piece that I think we've talked about investigating and will continue to do so. Thank you for your comments.
Great. We do have some time for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask a question of any of the panelists, I invite you to do that now. Here at table 1, we'll start.
Federico Salas Isnardi with Texas A&M University. And I have actually 2 questions, and one is for David Baker. Actually, it's interaction between the papers by Carly Ford and David Baker. And let's see, if college, as you mentioned, Carly, if college does not close the skill gap, then how does that relate to David's contention that what matters is what people do while getting the degree? Because you were talking about developing those cognitive skills. You're saying that college does not close the cognitive skill gap. So can you address that seeming contradiction? That's my first question.
Do you want me to give it?
Yeah, you're on both papers.
Okay. Yeah, so I think just as an aside, we had not practiced this together. So this is the first time that I think in some ways we're digging deeply into each other's papers. But how I think about that is not that I don't see it as a contradiction. I think there are, for first generation college students so overall, on average, college is not closing the skill gap for first generation college students. But for the students that do, there are, it's a distribution. So there are students that come out with very high skills. And that's who I think we're talking about in Dave's paper. We're talking about people who gain the skills within the credential. So it's not the credential alone, it's not the skills alone, it's this combined joint effect of the two.
Right. So regardless of the generational background or social background, quite a few people are getting things out of the BA and above, and that's crucial. But it appears that certain social groups get more, right? And probably because of their educational history all the way through, in terms of quality, and also maybe family support and ability to do that, right? We can't pull all that apart with these data. And the Hout effect is quite interesting, as Carly laid out in her paper, that it's a combination, but increasingly what one can do in the higher ed arena is very important to their outcomes. But that doesn't mean they completely drop all the baggage of maybe being in an underfunded American education school district. We create a lot of inequality by district and so forth. And that's also why Carly was saying it would be very useful in the next PIAAC to get more information on which institutions people went to, or at least which types, at the very least. so that we could maybe start to look at college effects and different kinds of effects. So I think they're compatible, but I would say that and she said half empty, half full. I mean, you would rather have first generation people go to college and get what they can. Now they may have come in with slightly lower skills or even substantially lower skills, and they're going to get less, but they still get quite a bit. Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
Well, I have a second question.
okay.
There's one other person here.
Oh, come on. And the second question is for Mark, and I think it relates to what Maureen was saying. And I was looking at your contention, Mark, from your paper, that literacy, you didn't find literacy to be a significant predictor on employment. People are employed regardless of literacy level. And I asked you if you have data to show what kind of employment those people have, because people with lower literacy may be employed, but how much money are they making? Can they support a family? And that kind of consideration. And I will give you simply one illustration. Texas prides itself, or the government of Texas does, on the amount of employment in Texas. Everybody is employed in Texas. Well, yeah, but most people are making $7.25. So that is not a family-sustaining wage. So yeah, they are employed, and literacy may not have an impact on their ability to be employed. So have you looked at that? What kind of employment?
I'd say when we looked at it, we looked at whether they were employed. So we found that literacy was a significant predictor of that. When we looked at whether they were employed at 35 hours per week or more, so full-time, it was not predictive of that. And it was not predictive of whether they were a supervisor in their job. So kind of one of those, how far advanced they were in their job. And earnings, click back over here. Earnings was significant until we added the industry and the ICT at work. So when we added the industry, and that means that we're only looking basically within certain industries. So is there variation within an industry? So that's why it went away there. But when we're just looking at kind of our model with years of education literacy, it was significant in those models.
Yeah, and if I can add, I think when we controlled for the industries themselves without the computer use at work, they were significant, and that was interesting. Then it becomes harder to tease them out. I think one of the challenges that we had, why we didn't focus more on the part-time employment, we couldn't distinguish who wanted full-time versus didn't. And so we had hours worked, and we turned that into more than 35, or at least 35, or less than 35. But these were rough measures, right? And that is a limitation, which in the revised version it says that. So yeah, a lot of people opt not to have full-time work. Some don't have that choice, right, and just get part-time work. But that wasn't something that we were able to tease out in these data.
Next question there in the middle, yes.
Deborah Kennedy from the Center for Applied Linguistics. This is a kind of a skunk comment disguised as a supportive remark. Carly, I want to thank you for what you said about encouraging PIAAC to collect data on where people went to school. I think that really could be extremely useful. My interest is in adults who are non-native speakers of English, and I think collecting that data on where they went to school could tell you, in their case, whether they went to school in a language other than English, which would have major effects on what you find. Now, Mark and Frank, you controlled for immigrant status, but I think there's more to discover there with regard to the work that you're doing. And it could also tell you some things about the parent-child relationship in the generational study that you're doing. And finally, it could tell you some things about occupational prestige. If a person is a doctor in Korea, but in the United States is working as a lab technician or as a dry cleaner because they can't get the medical credential here, that could make a real difference to what your outcomes are showing as well. So just wanted to reiterate that my support for the idea that PIAAC needs to collect that data. Thanks.
Yes, that would be very useful. And we are working on another set of analyses which are showing for immigrants that numeracy, having numeracy skills is key for them in the labor market, where literacy skills aren't as much, or hurts them, or more, it's more flat. But numeracy skills, well, we're not all ready to go here, but I think we're going to find a story around the different kinds of skills and immigration status, which would fit some of your concerns.
Great. And here at table 5, yes.
Hi, my name is Madeline Goodman. I'm from Educational Testing Service, and I have a couple different questions actually. For Frank and Mark, I'm curious, especially given what Dave just said, and in my own research, it seems like numeracy is such a strong predictor of labor market outcomes, why you chose to look exclusively at literacy. And I appreciate that the first year of the IELTS we don't have trend data for the US, but we do have it for the 2 years, and I think it would have been, or could be, a very interesting thing to look at. And then secondly, I just want to ask a little more broadly whether anyone looked at not just 4-year higher education, but the 2-year categories of education, and what the difference is in skill, particularly numeracy skill, where we, in the US seem to do the worst comparative to other countries, where that played out. And in my research, it seems like race is particularly relevant and something you don't want to factor out of this discussion in relation to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start, and then Mark can back me up if he wants to. So I take your point very seriously. To give away a little bit about our backgrounds, Mark and I both started in community college, and I referred earlier to the sociologist who introduced me to several of these ideas. Told me that I was the product that gave the system legitimacy, that you shouldn't get from community college to Stanford. That's not supposed to, or that idea, we expect that to hold up the whole system. So I do take that very seriously, and we are hoping to do, this is kind of preliminary work, and we are going to do more. Mark mentions we did run the models with the 2-year degree, and we are going to look at that. As you stated, ILS does not have any numeracy measures, and so we encountered several limitations, and we've offered to work with AIR to kind of write up a memo about some of the challenges with using 3 different data sets that are in many ways designed to be used that way, but there's still some things that you have to work through. So we didn't use numeracy exactly because of that reason. Within the 2012 version, numeracy and literacy are pretty correlated. I mentioned earlier that Will and I had done a paper previously on immigrant skills, and going to the other point that we heard earlier, that is where you see an interesting tension, especially between people with high literacy or high numeracy, but maybe low literacy. But I'd be happy to talk to you more later. Thank you.
Yeah, they share about 80% of common variance, so there's 20% still there, but there's a lot. In the first paper, we combined them both in there, so they're both in the C status. And in the first paper, which is on the PIAAC, we also have the some college 2-year degrees there, and they fit right in the middle in the overall pattern. So, but right, and race too. We're looking at all those things now. We just wanted to get the main stories out, and then we'll go forward with that. Thank you.
There's a couple questions there in the back of the room.
Hi.
And here, go with the mic. Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see you.
That's okay. My name is Diana Coho. I'm with the Federal Communications Commission, but I'm also a Penn State graduate, so yay. Anyway, my questions, it sort of crosses some of the areas, but I would like to start with the idea of the multi-generational research and gender. So what I'm thinking as I'm sitting here, I went to school from 1979 to 1983 at Penn State, but looking at my family history, if I were to get a question, the men in the family went to school, but not necessarily the women, and some of my aunts went back after they had raised their children and that kind of thing. So I'm looking at that as, something that may be affecting people that are multi-generational on your survey, but maybe they're the first woman to go to school, and then looking at that a little further with the underrepresentation in STEM and some of the other type literacy sets and the gender gap or gender differences, shall we say, in earning even within the same jobs. So I'm sort of looking at gender, similar to some of the race questions that were asked earlier, in terms of what you bring when you do go, and you may be a first-generation woman going to school, and then once you graduate, the earning and also the ability to get further credential, because like you said, to get some of the other credentials or the advanced degrees, that kind of thing often depends also on income. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm trying to remember I thought there were some interesting gender findings that I didn't present. So we definitely did find an earnings gap between men and women, no matter their generational status. That's not news to anyone in this room, so that was not reported. I think 2 things that I found interesting: there was no gender gap on occupational prestige, so women are starting to creep into higher prestige occupations. We know that's not true at the very, very top, but at least in the middle of the distribution. And then also we found that men and women had similar rates of major occupation match. Women were actually a little bit higher than men. So to me that suggests that perhaps female college students are making either better choices about what major to choose or more realistic choices. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism is there, but women had very high rates of major occupation match. But thank you for the comment.
Hello, I'm Clancy Wilson, and I'm with the Joseph Loretta Freeman Foundation, and we deal with literacy, health literacy. And I have a question for Carly and David. The question is, I know you focused on, and I know you controlled for race, but you focused on first generation and multi-generation. Did you have a look, or did you examine or think about what happens to that first generation when they become multi-generation? Do they close the gap because now they're a multi-generation, they've gone through the graduate, they have children? What happens to them now that they're considered the multi-generation families? And then for David, you mentioned, and I could have misunderstood, something about domains, and you said it was important for children to learn or teachers to teach about domains. What are those domains? Did I miss that? That you said that would be interested for teachers to teach it, both primary and higher ed level.
Great. Yeah, I think your question is an interesting and important one. Far too often, I think with survey data, we are happy with just parent education, but I think I mentioned this earlier, and I think you're underscoring that point, that we really need a second or third generation. Our computers can handle it now, so there's no reason why we shouldn't be asking about grandparent status, and we would get at that. Even if we can't do a longitudinal study, that's a lot of money, we could ask a couple grandparent questions and get at that very issue that you're speaking to.
I think I might have said it in regard to domain general intelligence, and what I was saying there is that there's a lot of literature now, really nice studies that show that going to school imparts and shapes domain and general intelligence, deep thinking skills. The curriculum, I think, in the United States has shifted over the century towards those skills. We could always do better, but that process is happening right now. And the Flynn effect, if you know that, the growing fluid IQ, is a direct outcome of the expansion of and access to education in places like the United States. There's pretty strong evidence of that. So it wasn't so much, I wasn't saying what teachers should teach in terms of domains, but I was saying that a big benefit of education in addition to specific skills like numeracy and literacy, are these enhancements of domain general intelligence.
And we have time for one more question. In the back there, it looks like table 12.
I guess that's us. Okay. Hi, I'm Jim Parker with the National Council for Adult Learning. And a couple quick questions, mostly to David, but to anyone else. As we know, and research has indicated for many years, that a high school diploma is not a high school diploma. It depends. A lot depends on the high school. A lot depends on the school district, maybe even the state. And you mentioned that to be a hair cutter in 20 states, you have to have a high school diploma. And in Ohio, you really got to be good. I love that. But that means that almost 2/3 of states don't have that kind of gatekeeping, at least for that very important occupation. Also, because of the inequality between the value of diploma, skill value, wouldn't it be great to not only see if they could identify the college they went to, but the high school they went to? Would be some, I think, some really interesting data. Secondly, I think, David, you asked, what are they doing while they're in college? And the answer, of course, is they're working. We all worked, to some degree, our way through college. And the skills gained while working, or with working, I think, for me, it was equally important as what I gained in college, maybe even more so. I'd like to ask Carly a rhetorical question, which you don't have to answer. But you were an intern for 4 or 5 summers right here in River City. And, you know, what skills and how much skill did you gain through that? I'm guessing a lot. So just some things to consider.
Yeah, I totally agree. As I said, in our measures, we don't know all the contributors to cognitive skill. And I talked about a possible math effect of people who have cognitive skills, get jobs that demand more cognitive skills, have hobbies that demand cognitive skills. This all can generate that. Collecting which kind of high school you went to would be great. I'm sure the PIAAC people are groaning because it's not just in the U.S., you know, and trying to explain to subjects the ISKED categories, and I don't know, you know. But we'll all get out of town before that. But that would certainly be nice, particularly for the older generations in PIAAC, because you know, one of the things that's going on here is a shift in the enrollment patterns quite substantially, and a shift in the size of the population experiencing those education levels, which has all, I mean, partly what Carly's looking at, partly you get a much wider spread of people with different cognitive abilities, working conditions, all those things you said. And that's all hidden in the data. We can't pull that out now, but that would be very, very nice. Thank you.
And I just have a 2-sentence response to your rhetorical question, which is I absolutely gained many skills interning at AIR through my 4 to 5 summers. However, Penn State wouldn't hire me without my PhD from NYU. So that's what C status is, the joint interaction of the credential and the skill. Whether I got the skill at NYU or not, Penn State wants me to have a credential, right?
Yeah. I just wanted to comment. I think you brought up the point about people working while they're in college, and I think that's an important point. And I think people have been looking at, you know, sort of how much people work and how that affects how they do in college and whether they can stay in college. And I think that's an important piece. And it might be relevant, Carly, I think, to the work that you're doing looking at family origin, because, of course, for people who are coming from less well-off families, they tend to work more, and that could influence, even though they make it through college, that could influence whether they really have the time to learn and focus on their studies as much as people who can work less while they're staying in college. So it could be an interesting thing to take a look at.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to take one last chance to just summarize with a comment. I haven't said much from the Department of Labor perspective, but where we're kind of ending today, a few things strike me. The meaning and what's included in the definition of credential, I think, is really important. And to a lot of points that have been brought up, there are a variety of institutions, both formal education and other, that award credentials. And I think there's growing interest in trying to understand the value of credentials from a very broad sense and how we can make, especially when it comes to public investment, how we can help make informed choices and help people understand the value of that investment in credentials that are and are not awarded by institutions of higher education. We're certainly in the middle of that, and I think absent any data that connects it to the type of institution, from what we're talking about here, I'm not sure if PIAAC includes non-educationally awarded credentials, but maybe that's something to add to the list. But without being able to wait for that, I hope we can find some ways to explore that. And it sounds like maybe you're looking into that connection across some of the work you're doing already. So that's very exciting for me to think about. I want to thank Carly, Dave, Mark, Frank, and Maureen for being here this morning, and thank you to AIR and NCES and all of you in the room. I think next is time for discussion at your tables, and so I'll turn it over for instructions on that. Thanks, everybody.